So, hello, thank you for joining this webinar. Welcome, this webinar on compensatory conservation schemes. My name is Tom Williams, and I am the International Nature Lead at the Green Finance Institute. In today's webinar, we're going to dive into compensatory conservation schemes with the insights of some of the leading institutions who have been supporting the development and implementation of these schemes globally. And we will also provide you with some information about a new collaboration that aims to provide technical and institutional support to governments in setting up and implementing such schemes. First, some housekeeping. We will be recording this session and we'll share the recording and the slides in due course. As we move through the agenda, please feel free to post questions. We'll have a couple of moments in the agenda where we can open up the floor to your questions. And we do have simultaneous interpretation available today from English to Spanish. So if you want to listen to the Spanish interpretation, please do click on the icon at the bottom of the Zoom bar, which is a globe, and it says interpretation. On to the agenda. I'll continue for about 5 minutes to provide a bit of background and context to our session today. We'll then have a panel discussion with some of the leading proponents of compensatory conservation schemes globally. We'll have representatives from the Environmental Policy Innovation Centre, EPIC, from Terrasos, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS. We'll then move into a couple of case studies. We'll have a look at Mozambique and the United States of America to get a sense of how and what implementation looks like on the ground. And then I'll wrap things up in about 5 minutes towards the end of the session. Okay, so compensatory conservation schemes, what are we talking about and what do they look like? Our starting point is the mitigation hierarchy. All compensation schemes are anchored here. This framework sets out a clear sequence for managing environmental impacts. First, avoid harm wherever possible, then minimize impacts that cannot be avoided, restore affected ecosystems, and only as a last resort, offset any remaining damage. So compensatory conservation sits at this final stage. It's not a substitute for good planning or impact reduction, but a mechanism to address residual impacts that persist after all reasonable mitigation measures have been taken. And in practice, what this means is that when development leads to unavoidable biodiversity loss, actions are taken elsewhere to generate equivalent or ideally greater ecological gains. These schemes can take several forms. You see some examples on the right side of the screen. They may involve restoring degraded habitats, creating new ecosystems, or protecting existing areas that are under threat. For example, a project that impacts wetlands might fund the restorations of wetlands in other locations or secure long-term protection for a similar habitat. And increasingly, these approaches are formalized through mechanisms such as biodiversity offsets, conservation banking, or habitat credit systems. However, not all impacts are equally substitutable. Effective compensatory conservation really depends on principles like ecological equivalence, additionality, and long-term security. And it also requires robust monitoring and governments to ensure that promised outcomes are actually delivered over time. So in short, compensatory conservation schemes are really about balancing what is lost with what is gained, but within a strict framework that prioritizes avoidance and minimization first. And why are these schemes increasingly important? We're entering a period of unprecedented global infrastructure expansion. Trillions of dollars are projected to be invested over the coming decades in energy systems, transport networks, and urban development, for example. This scale of development is essential, but it also places enormous pressure on ecosystems and biodiversity. And at the same time, we have a well-documented and persistent financing gap for conservation. Public funding alone is insufficient. And while private capital is growing, it still falls short of what is needed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So compensatory conservation schemes really sit at the intersection of these two challenges. They provide a mechanism to channel a portion of infrastructure and development finance into measurable conservation outcomes. In effect, they can really help to redirect capital flows, linking economic development with environmental responsibility. But this is not straightforward. Designing schemes that are credible, equitable, and ecologically meaningful can be quite complex, and there are real challenges around ensuring additionality, avoiding perverse incentives, and delivering outcomes that are durable over a long period of time. So their importance is growing, not just because of the scale of development, but because they represent one of the few tools available to help bridge the conservation finance gap while still enabling the infrastructure investment that the world urgently needs. And we are seeing a growing number of countries establish and support these kinds of schemes. Here is some recent analysis from the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, IAPB, which looked at government-led approaches to nature credit markets. So their scope was a bit broader than what we are talking about today, as they also include voluntary schemes, both contribution and compensation, as well as compliance markets, which is our focus today. So they identified a total of 19 nature credit schemes, which you can see on the screen. And more broadly, and I think this is citing from an OECD paper, there are policies mandating biodiversity offsets in 42 countries globally. So we have a growing number of experience of these schemes, some like in the US, which we'll hear a bit more about later, established over decades, whereas others are much more recent. And just to go back to my earlier slide about infrastructure growth, nearly half of that infrastructure growth will occur in countries that do not currently mandate biodiversity offsets. And this really underlines both the urgency and the importance of developing these schemes. So along with this practical experience, which is growing, we have a range of best practices, tools, and principles that have been codified over the years. And on the screen, you'll see an example of just a few from the many, from the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, BBOP, which many of you will be aware of, through to the high-level principles for biodiversity credit markets from IAPB, BCA, and the World Economic Forum, and knowledge products. As part of the larger Revenues for Nature program that GFI leads with UNEP FI and UNDP BIOFIN, we have published 3 guidebooks, the wetland mitigation banking that you see on your screen, but also guidebooks on the biodiversity net gain in the UK and habitat banks in Colombia. And we're also seeing whole programs of work, such as Combo, which we will hear more about in a moment, distilling lessons learned from across different countries. So we have a wealth of knowledge and experience that we can tap into. And as we look to develop and implement more of these schemes, we have an opportunity to really shorten the development pathways, as we can learn from what has worked and what didn't work in certain locations and optimize schemes along the way. So taking this knowledge and experience, a few organizations, you'll see the logos on the screen, decided to map out end to end what it takes to develop, implement, and iterate these kinds of schemes. And we came up with these 11 key design components that you see on the screen that take you through policy development, market development, and scaling. And for each of these components, we have some descriptive text that highlights the key elements of each component that you should be cognizant of as you develop and implement compensatory conservation schemes. This is not intended to be a step-by-step sequential process. No, experience has taught us that the development, implementation, and optimization of these schemes is iterative. So the reality is that a number of these components will be addressed in parallel and also returned to in the design and implementation phase. We will be launching this document that includes these 11 components next week. It will be included in the follow-up email you'll receive with the slides and the recordings to the session, so you can take a look in detail when it's published next week. And what we really want to do is to provide a starting point for governments who are looking to develop new schemes or optimize existing schemes. These are the components that you essentially need to be thinking about. And over the coming months, we plan to bring these components to life through the publication of some case studies that provide grounded experience in their development and implementation. I'll come back at the end of today's session with a bit more about how we want to support compensatory conservation schemes in the run-up to CBD COP 17. Okay, now I'd like to turn to our panel to bring to life some of the programs and experiences that I just shared with you. And I would like to introduce first Ryan Sarsfield. Ryan is a senior advisor for biodiversity markets at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, that's EPIC. We have Amrei von Hase, who is the Combo Program Director with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And we have Vanessa Garcia, who is the international business developer at Terrasos. So let me just stop sharing. Okay, all right. Well, let's kick things off, Ryan, with you. Thanks for joining the panel today, Ryan. Really appreciate it. And you've observed mitigation banking in the US over many years, and you've also had visibility to similar schemes operated globally. Where do you see the greatest opportunities from learning from those experiences as other countries could leverage them? So if another country is thinking about establishing these kinds of compensatory schemes, what kind of learnings have you come across?
Good morning. Well, good afternoon, whichever time zone everyone is in. Glad to be here. Thank you, Tom. I think it's a bit of I'll say two things that are a bit in tension, but there isn't quite one size fits all for how to do a compensatory offset scheme. There's a number of principles we know that are essential. We have, as you showed on that slide, a number of key components, and they can be put in different orders and they can be expressed in different ways. So there isn't one size that fits all, but we can definitely adapt the design. We could call it like evolutionary convergence. And we see this when we've had discussions that Epic has hosted where we have folks from two or three different continents discussing a particular challenge, and we find that it is worked through the local country's policy and practice and land use history in different ways because every country has its own style of doing things, but we know that there are these core principles that we need to fit in one way or the other. Things like permanence, things like additionality, figuring out how to balance government regulation with the private sector. That's something we fight about in the US all the time, but every country does it in their own particular way. And so there is no singular recipe, but we know that we're still baking a cake, call it what you will, right? So, for instance, permanence. In the US, we have what we call easements that allows a long-term or potentially permanent perpetual protection on a piece of land. And we use this for different reasons under the law. And we use that when we want to have perpetual protection for a mitigation bank, right? And that is connected to the deed of the land. In England, there aren't easements, but there are covenants. That's a different way to do it. And every country will have different limits on contract length, different ways of protecting land for the long term, and critically different land tenure systems. And we see that even within countries. So within the United States, we have ways we might vary it between the US states, and we see variations between how we might do it in a typical national level or on tribal lands in the United States, where permanence is equally important for those tribes that are participating in the markets, but they need to express the permanence in a different way that fits their own sovereignty, right? So we see that wherever you're doing one of these habitat banks that fits into a scheme like this, you need to find a way to do permanence, but you're going to do it in your own way, right? Ecological equivalence, we see that in a very similar way. So England has its nature metric. It's built off of the really rich botanical knowledge of England's natural systems, and it is adapted to the landscapes and the ecosystems and the diversity of England. But Colombia, way more diverse than the United States, way more diverse than England, mega diversity and an incredible range between the mountain ranges and altitudinal variations. How do you do ecological equivalency in Colombia? It's going to be a little different. There's really interesting challenges, and Vanessa could probably speak to that a bit better than I can. So, how do you do it in any particular way? If you're a country that is more, for instance, like Colombia, if you have extreme biodiversity in the tropics, you may want to look to Colombia. How did Colombia do this particular challenge? How did they find the solution to it? So, in each of these challenges, we know that we can adapt a relatively small list of core ideas, core integrity principles. They're essential. We have to do it one way or the other. We can do it in a locally appropriate way that fits the local political and cultural and economic context. And we can do it. But I would say overall, we know that it can be done, right? We can find solutions that work in these places, and we know what we need to do to get it right. So that I think is it bodes well for countries that want to get into this. There's a long process of development, but they can certainly do it on their own terms, fitting into these models that we know can work.
Great, thank you, Ryan. I think it also speaks to the impetus behind the collaboration that we'll speak more about later, this C2S2, is that we have this critical mass of experience and knowledge now, where we have these sort of common principles that have merged and different ways of adopting and adapting those principles in different locations. But it really does seem that we've got that critical mass of experience and knowledge under our belt. Vanessa, moving to you. Terrasos has been active for a number of years in South America, but also beyond there. And I'm always intrigued by what we call triggers. What was it that started something off in a country to explore these kinds of schemes? So I'm wondering, from your experience at Terrasos, what are some of the triggers you have observed that give the impetus to government to consider implementing these kinds of schemes?
Okay, thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. Buenos días. My name is Vanessa Garcia. I work in Terrasos and I'm based in Colombia, as Ryan was saying. So we see there are three main triggers for governments to adopt compensatory schemes. One of them is the compliance gap. So in many countries, we have environmental impact assessments that require compensation. Um, the thing is that regulation is not in place. The regulation is in place, but there is a lack of implementation of the regulation. So countries are doing compensation, but it's often fragmented. It's very slow. It's difficult to verify. Projects are being handled one by one, and there is a lack of accountability on the outcomes. So governments are seeing mechanisms like habitat banks, and they understand that it's a way of channeling those investments and handling the compliance gap. So the first trigger is the regulation is in place, but there is a lack of compliance. Um, the second trigger is, as you were mentioning before, in many countries, especially in the global south, there's a huge development pipeline. So roads are being built. There's a need of improving energy infrastructure. There's a lot of mining happening, especially in Africa and South America, because of the energy transition. So this is going to create impacts, and governments are acknowledging that, and they're trying to manage the demand in a more efficient way. So that's the second trigger. So all of these projects that are happening, that are creating impacts, and that need to compensate for their impacts. And there's a great opportunity of doing that in a more efficient way. And then the third one, which is very obvious, is the opportunity of financing conservation through compensations. So we all know that in some countries, in many countries, there's a huge gap in regards of the maintenance of protected areas in very important ecosystems. So compensations are a tool for financing conservation at scale. And we've seen it in Colombia that there is a very important opportunity to mobilize private capital towards the restoration of ecosystems. So just to give a summary of this, um, governments are implementing compensatory schemes because of the compliance gap. Regulation is in place, but there is a lack of compliance. That's very tangible. There is a growing pipeline of projects for mining, for infrastructure, and then there is a financing gap, and we understand that we can channel resources through compensations.
Excellent. Thank you, Vanessa, and also for that very concise summary. And yeah, just to bring to life on that final point in terms of mobilizing finance, and we'll hear more about the US market a little bit later on, which is obviously very mature. But I think that's now transacting over 3.6 billion, I think, US dollars was the last figure that I've seen, just to give a sense of the scale of funding that these kinds of schemes, albeit very mature in the UK market, are actually attracting. Thank you, Vanessa. We'll come back to you in a moment. Let's move on to Amrei. And I very briefly sort of flashed on the screen the COMBO program, which is the Conservation, Mitigation and Biodiversity Offsets program. So could you tell us, Amrei, a little bit more about this program? What is it? Where does it focus? And who are you engaging with?
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm part of a small team at the Wildlife Conservation Society that works on business and biodiversity impact. And I'm based in South Africa, in Cape Town. So to get to your question, Tom, the Wildlife Conservation Society over the past decade, in fact, has led the Conservation, Mitigation and Biodiversity Offset Program, COMBO for short, which was funded by the French Development Agency, AFD, and the French Facility for Global Environment, FFEM. And we implemented this with a range of key partners across 6 countries in Africa and Asia, so all developing country contexts. And the countries are Guinea, Madagascar, Mozambique, Uganda, Laos, and Myanmar. And we've just concluded the second phase of this program. So it's really a great moment to share some of the key insights that we've had and some of the tools that have been developed in these countries that are really useful beyond the countries in which we worked, however. And you showed one of those on your slide earlier, and I can point you to additional resources that we've developed later. So at its core, COMBO focused on strengthening mitigation systems in these countries so that development projects, infrastructure or mining projects, extractive projects, fully address their impacts on biodiversity, aiming to achieve no net loss or net gain of biodiversity, but at the same time contribute to reaching national and global biodiversity goals and targets. And This is all grounded in best practice in the mitigation hierarchy, which you went through earlier. Just to remind everyone, the mitigation hierarchy is focused on avoidance, to the greatest extent possible, avoiding impacts on biodiversity, minimizing impacts, then restoring damage, and as a last resort, implementing biodiversity offsets or compensatory conservation to address residual impacts. A central part of this collaboration of Combo was working closely together with the host governments, especially ministries of environment, but also across economic sectors, very importantly, and then engaging with private sector and civil society actors, all of who have a really critical role to play in this process. In each country, the work that we pursued focused around four key pillars of work. And those were, first of all, strengthening policy to embed best practice in the mitigation hierarchy and improving the supporting governance systems. Secondly, developing biodiversity data, maps, tools, practical tools, etc., like national metrics that can be applied at the site level, online data platforms to make information accessible. And that was to build the technical foundations for better planning and decision making on the mitigation hierarchy. The third pillar focused on intensive capacity building of all of the actors, but particularly focused on government. And that included providing technical assistance within governments to improve capacity on review processes, for example, for EIAs and decision-making processes. And then the last fourth pillar focused on assessing case studies, so real case studies on the ground across different contexts, restoration, conservation, and development contexts, and implementing pilot projects to get an idea of what works in practice on the ground when it comes to implementing compensatory conservation, and using this to inform practice going forward. The Combo countries made significant progress over this time frame, and we've captured those results in different tools and reports and documents on our website. And my colleague Hugo Costa will later on delve a little bit into one of the countries, Mozambique, to give participants a sort of more direct idea of how the approach was rolled out in one of our countries.
Excellent. Thank you, Amrei. And starting to give a little bit more granular flavour of what it takes to set up these schemes, and which we've tried to capture in those 11 key components that I showed earlier. And we will post some of these really useful tools that will be referenced in today's discussion on the website next week when we circulate the recordings and the slides, etc. So don't worry if you don't catch everything today. We'll compile all the useful tools and resources for you. I want to go back to Ryan, then Vanessa and Amrei again with a second question. And we're getting into sort of some of the nitty-gritty now. And as you look at those 11 design components that I shared, you've all contributed to developing those components based on the experience that you've just shared. Really interesting to hear from your perspective and your experience, where you've been working with markets at various levels of maturity, from just starting out to being established over many years. What do governments or market participants more broadly find the most challenging? Which one of those components, in your experience, is the most challenging to get your hands around? So Ryan, I'll start with you. Get your perspectives.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny seeing this evolution of each system. The US's market has been going on for decades now, and it has constantly been refined. And England and Colombia, younger markets, but even there we see these constant refinements. So I think there's a really tricky balance to make of figuring out how to make refinements that can help you solve interim problems or longer term problems that help you balance the market, but they don't undermine the core policy, right? You don't want to, for instance, weaken the regulations that make demand possible. But you do need to adapt things as you start to understand the realities, how supply and demand will match up. So pilots, super essential. In all of these systems, you need to start out with pilots to test your metric, to see what it looks like to do a financial transaction that involves a site that needs credits after following the mitigation hierarchy, and a bank that can provide those credits. And when you go from a pilot or a handful of pilots into something starting to look like a market, it's a very rocky time. How do you balance this supply and demand? I think there's often an interest in helping supply grow because you need supply. Demand can be achieved through the regulatory structures, but they have to be more or less similar in scale so that you don't have far too much supply and no demand, which means maybe your regulations aren't encouraging the use of credits where it's appropriate. And if you have far too much demand, and no supply, you might start to undermine the policy's political backing, right? It looks like, oh, this policy isn't working. We need to change it. So you're going to need to do changes, but you need to do it in a way that helps you move forward and not undermines the base, right? Um, I think the other one, and we're working with a country in Latin America right now where we think this is a really interesting issue to for them to figure out, and hopefully we'll continue to work with them on this, is how much centralization should there be in the different levels of regulation and financial flows that the market involves. So different countries have different levels of governance structures, either at a local level or at a centralized national level, and every variation in between. And likewise, where there is more or less confidence that you can have direct transactions between buyers and sellers of credits, those that need credit for compliance and those that can supply them through habitat banks. So, how much should those financial flows and those transactions, they need to have oversight from the government and from the regulators one way or the other, but having it be directly between the buyers and sellers, should there be an intermediary? And that's a question that different countries can figure out, but getting that balance right so that you still do have the necessary transactions, that you do attract an investment is a really delicate balance. Um, One of those ways that that's expressed is through fund structures, right? It's very common in all sorts of conservation activities to create funds because we're all desperate for more funding for restoration, more funding for protection of really essential places. So, should we have funds through which the financial flows go, right? That can work. It also creates a lot of challenges. You get certain advantages if, when you need to buy credits, you're paying directly to those that create the habitat banks because immediately you're getting that ecological equivalence, you're getting the financial flow from the demand to the supply. So this theme runs through all this. How do you get it just right and continue to adapt it in ways that will push you forward without holding you back? All right. So that's a general way to put it.
Yeah, and as you said, this balancing act, and as we maybe said a couple of times now, it's very much an iterative process, and a big part of that, I think, is learning through doing, which speaks again to the importance of pilot projects, doesn't it? Thank you, Ryan. Vanessa, be interested to hear your perspectives. What do you see as the most challenging components that we've mapped out for governments and other market players?
So, from our perspective, ensuring long-term additionality and permanence. That's one of the most important challenges for governments and also for organizations such as Terrasos that are structuring and developing this type of projects. So there's a lot of uncertainty around how conservation outcomes are real and long-lasting. And so we see that the permanence component is very, very important. And you need to think about not only the structures and the supply and the demand, but also the financial resources that are needed for the next 30, 40, 50 years in order to be able to sustain the investments that you're doing. So, yeah.
Excellent. And that long-term planning, I mean, it's so important, and it also speaks to the reason we wanted to put together this end-to-end overview of the key components, is that at the very early stages of developing these schemes, you have an eye on what's coming further down the line in terms of market development, financial sustainability, etc. So you can have a view of that from the outset. Amrei, same question to you from your side in terms of what components are you seeing most challenging from some of the countries that you mentioned Combo is engaging with?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to complement what the other two speakers said, because those are really important aspects and really important challenges. But I'll look at it a little bit from the perspective of the government, so not so much the market players. And based on our experience, perhaps with countries at the sort of initial stages, I would say that there are three challenges that I can highlight. The first one is securing cross-sectoral buy-in, which can be quite challenging. So effective implementation of mitigation system means going beyond engaging with environment ministries. One really needs strong involvement from sectors like finance and planning and extractives and so on. And bringing these approaches into national development strategies and sector plans and so on, and making sure that different parts of government are actually working together and coordinated is really important, but it's also challenging in practice. And that is not something that's, specific to mitigation systems, but it is really important for that to work well. The second one is that, and this is our observation from Combo, is that moving from policy to implementation can be quite complex. So introducing regulations is obviously crucial, but it's only really the first step in the process, as Vanessa said earlier as well. And to ensure real implementation of the policies and to have operational systems means investing in the underlying institutional systems and governance structures and administrative coordination and so on. And I think the investment that requires is often underestimated. And it requires sustained political will and enough resources and dedicated staff time to ensure that the systems function effectively. And then the last one that I think underpins a lot of these different aspects is that building and sustaining adequate capacity is critical, and it takes time, and it's an ongoing effort. And those skills are needed across government and NGOs and all of the different actors involved, consultancies and so on. And building the capacity is resource intensive, and it can be undermined by staff turnover within government or institutional changes and so on. And our observation has just been that it really requires an intensive effort. And some of the things that we did as part of Combo, which were quite effective, were to embed technical assistance within government, as I mentioned earlier, to boost capacity quite immediately and to build capacity over the long term, to establish expert committees, to promote peer-to-peer learning and train the trainer programs and so on. And that can help with building some of the capacity that is required over the long term, and the sort of, I guess, resilience in the system that's needed for effective functioning.
Great, thank you, Amrei. Two key things there: political will and capacity. Again, point to principles that are universally seen in countries establishing these schemes, right? And we could spend another webinar going into how do you sustain political will, how do you capacitate the right institutions and the right people, and some of the different modalities that you just described. That's probably something we can do further down the line in terms of bringing more of those shared experiences to the group. I want to take some questions from the audience. Do use the Q&A function, and I see there is one question that's come in, which is directed to you, Ryan, if I could come to you. From Dan, can you share examples of corporate-led voluntary biodiversity offsets in the US? In particular, any examples that illustrate company investment in local land conservation, restoration, and partnerships? So over to you, Ryan, if you can answer that one.
Sure. Yeah, interesting question. We have talked today mostly about the regulatory side, but we often stress at Epic that the way that a voluntary market should work is under different circumstances without the regulatory context of the government, but operating with similar standards. So to Dan's question, there is a history of different kinds of corporate investment in biodiversity of all types. Everything from fully fledged conservation projects, protected area support, things like that, and other things that are perhaps less ecologically robust, maybe sometimes tree planting that doesn't go far beyond just the initial planting, right, for a photo op. So what we want to see is that these same principles can be applied over the long term to the other kinds of projects out there that likewise want to be structured as a credit, as a, if not an offset, then something that does have the structures of a credit, that has permanent additionality, that has a methodology, that has third-party verification. So this is a market that's growing in different places. There's lots of methodologies that we're seeing all over the world. The US is catching up to this. It's been a little slower, but we do have among Epic partners, companies like Carlbo, the Swedish forest investors who have a pilot project in Louisiana, and they're creating biodiversity outcomes within the context of production forestry, which is really interesting. Then we have Green Diamond, who's doing a project in Oregon in a montane meadow, and they're developing for a corporate buyer a restoration of that meadow that will fit within the broader forested landscape and have hydrological wetland benefits and follow a methodology. And then we're also working with the Assiniboine Sioux tribe of Fort Peck, Montana, on buffalo restoration. So taking the kind of work that they have already been doing on buffalo restoration and trying to turn that into something that can have a regulatory, not a regulatory, a methodological structure to it and measurement so that that can be packaged together for a corporate buyer. So that piece, the buyers are catching up. We're seeing often that those buyers are interested in mixing biodiversity outcomes with carbon, mixing biodiversity with water, and we're hoping that that will grow, but we're definitely seeing growing interest in it.
Yeah, it's interesting as we see the emergence of voluntary and compliance markets coming up in parallel in jurisdictions and how those markets sort of develop jointly. Amrei, question just come here about Combo program. Does Combo help countries develop governance in public institutions to implement offset frameworks? How do you find this in practice? After countries have the new regulations, is there the actual capacity to make it work? Do you want to come in and respond to that one, Amrei?
Thank you. Yes, really good questions. And that was something that we really focused on in the Combo countries, was to ensure that these supporting governance systems and structures and coordination, for example, within government were established, that the need for those was clear, and that they were established, and we focused on building the capacity of those, often new committees, for example. And I think Hugo will later give an example in Mozambique how that was done. But really important was to have these kinds of structures established early on to, once the regulations are established, often requiring the establishment of these kinds of institutional structures as well, so that they could then be part of the program's capacity building. In Mozambique, for example, there was significant focus on building the capacity of the technical coordination unit within the relevant agency. in order to ensure that everybody was clear about what this requires. The technical committee undertook a first review of the first biodiversity offset management plan that was created. So that was part of what we did in Combo. The relevant structures differed obviously from country to country, suited to the existing context, and to ensure that there weren't new structures created unnecessarily, but that use could be made of existing committees, for example, that had a coordination role already. Capacity, as I said, our capacity building focused on some of those kind of governance structures and mechanisms. But it is really important to highlight also that that is an ongoing requirement. There isn't a time where suddenly that capacity is just there and does not need to be kind of continued to be built. It's a little bit according to what Ryan was saying, is that as the system gets adapted, new skills need to be learned and applied by the actors involved. So it's an ongoing requirement to continue training and building capacity.
Excellent, thank you, Amrei. And as you said, we'll learn a bit more about the Mozambique example in a moment from Hugo. Time for a final question to the panelists. So we'll go to Ryan, then Vanessa and Amrei. And you're all to some degree sort of engaging with governments, but hypothetically speaking, if you were advising a government today that wanted to explore compensatory schemes, where would you advise them to focus their initial effort and time? And then if possible, I'm just seeing there's another question coming in here. Maybe you want to respond also, which is more general, but what role do you think NGOs and charities can play in this space? So Ryan, what would your advice be to government X on initiating compensatory schemes?
Government X, yeah. Fortunately, we are advising governments on some of these issues, and as the C2S2 program grows, we hope to be doing this with other countries that are interested. Hopefully, with some of the attendees today, this is exactly what we're trying to do: is take these lessons, work with countries that are able to speak to them from their own experience, find out what their own national priorities are, fit in these different integrity priorities into a policy design, and work with them to see where that can go. So, hypothetically speaking, though, I think it's a lot of things to kick off a model all at once, and trying to build everything all at once is really difficult. Some things can be kicked off. For instance, the metric. How are you going to measure both the degree of impact that a development project is causing and the degree of uplift that you get out of a habitat bank, for example, right? There's usually an area unit that is used. Different ecosystems have different ways of doing it, whether it is a wetland or a stream or a forest habitat. You can start to pilot that metric in all sorts of ways. You don't need to have a fully fledged market to see how that metric works on the ground, to get practitioners using it, to have market participants or future market participants familiar with how it works so that they can start to think through, all right, if we're going to build this highway in 3 years, what does it look like if we're actually measuring our impacts more methodically? Likewise, with the mitigation hierarchy, it's possible to project some of these things and try out and learn these methodologies ahead of time before you're actually doing it on the ground. I think another really critical piece that there's a hesitancy sometimes to just create a new agency out of whole cloth. Each country's regulatory structure that currently has markets has the roles divided or unified in different ways. In the US, we're going to hear more from Greg in a couple minutes talking about the Army Corps of Engineers and what they do, right? It's fairly centralized for our wetland and stream market, and for endangered species habitats, it's with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But it's quite different in Colombia. And given the Colombian example for one, the protected areas system is the entity that can evaluate a bank in certain ways, not for all the ways necessary for the market, but they can see, looking at that bank, is this bank suitable to operate as a bank? Because that is the entity, the Protected Areas System agency, that can say what is the ecological quality of this site? Is the restoration what we're looking for, right? Similarly, which government agency, either one that exists now or how would a future structure work to work within this new paradigm of environmental licensing? Because basically every country will have some structural process and some agency that will review projects and give a thumbs up or down and tell you what you need to do. But moving from that process into something where there is a methodical implementation of the mitigation hierarchy, that they're able to say effectively, like, this is actually the need you have to buy credits, or you need to, not develop here because this site is too important to develop. Making those decisions and having those competencies distributed and intertwined with your existing competencies is a really tricky problem. So figuring out from the baseline and having enough staff to do that and fund it, right? These are very tricky things, like all kind of new government operations, is do you have the capacity within the government? And a lot of countries definitely do, but you need to figure out how to adapt and fund it and then make it possible for the longer term, I would say. I'll leave the NGO question for my co-panelists.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Vanessa, what would be your advice to a government thinking about this?
So we are also working with some governments in Latin America, and what we have learned in the process is that you need to have a clear policy signal. So it doesn't need to be like new legislation or the creation of a new agency, as Ryan was saying, but just giving clear signals on when compensation is required, what are the conditions, and how different entities can implement those compensations. So that's the first advice, to give clear signals on how to do it. Then we have seen that it's very valuable to have a pilot in place with real demand. So, for example, if you work with the infrastructure or the mining sectors, you're able to pilot and understand what are the needs and how we can test the different assumptions that are being done through the different policies. And then it's very important for governments to propose to propose a minimum integrity criteria. So if we want to have a market that's working, you need to be able to, from the beginning, you need to be able to define what's additionality, what's the equivalence that you're going to be using, how permanence will be ensured, and what are the basic MRB systems that will be in place for measuring the outcomes. So having clear policy signals, having a pilot, and then having minimum integrity criteria. And for the NGOs, I think there's a very interesting role, because they have been working, at least in South America, for several years with the governments. They already have the relationship and the trust. So there's a huge opportunity there to build the policy and to be able to connect with the private sector.
Excellent. Thank you, Vanessa. Very, very pragmatic. And I'm glad to say that I think all of those components you mentioned are illustrated in our 11 design components, which folks can read about more when they see that next week. Amrei, last word to you from our panel. What would you advise Government X who was thinking about developing a compensatory conservation scheme?
So, I mean, I suppose that where a government should focus initially depends partly or largely where they are in the process, how well developed their existing policy and systems already are. But what we found an effective starting point is actually to take a step back and undertaking a sort of readiness assessment. So that can be a policy gap analysis, a capacity gap analysis, data gap analyses, just to see what might be needed, and then using those to develop a roadmap that sets clear priorities and sequencing and responsibilities, and can serve as a practical guide for what needs to be put in place and when. So that's a kind of very high level general approach, but I think it can function in lots of different contexts. There's already pretty good guidance out there to support this kind of process. Those include the government roadmap to no net loss that was produced by the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, BBOP, back in the day. And then more recently, lessons learned in using this roadmap in the Combo countries, where we've compiled what are the lessons learned from using this kind of roadmap, and sort of from a very practical perspective, how can that inform the steps to take forward. Yep. And then I wanted to say that I try to answer the NGO question live, and I'm not sure if I've succeeded in doing that. Oh, yes, I have. Okay. And not live. I mean, I typed an answer just to set out some of the roles that an NGO might wish to play in a system like this.
Fantastic. Fantastic multitasking, Amrei. Thank you. And this has been a super insightful panel, just to get that breadth of experience from different geographies, different levels of maturity of the kinds of schemes that you've been engaging with. And of course, we've only sort of scratched the surface of those experiences. But as I've mentioned a couple of times, we've tried to capture many of those in the design components that I shared earlier, and will circulate a little bit later next week. So thank you, Ryan, Amrei, and Vanessa, for those contributions. We're now going to get a little bit into the weeds, if you like, of some of these more practical experiences. So we're first going to hear from Hugo Costa, who's going to talk us through the Mozambique experience, which we've previewed a little bit in the discussion earlier. Then we'll hear from Greg DeYoung, who is with the Westervelt Ecological Services, to hear a little bit more about the US experiences. So with that, I'll hand over to Hugo.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. So my name is Hugo Costa, and I'm the Director of Business and Biodiversity Impact at WCS. And my presentation, as said, focuses on a specific case study under the Combo program, which Amrei has already explained. So in this case, I will provide you with the details of what we have achieved in Mozambique so far. So next slide, please. Okay, so I want Amrei explained already all this. So I just like to highlight that our approach is focused on the principle that a compliance system is the most effective way to on how to ensure adequate mitigation and achieving no net loss and net gain. Okay, let's move to next slides. Okay, so Amrei already touched on all these aspects, but I'm just going to go through them again, just explaining that the program is based on the Combo's approach is based on these four components. First one, tackling policy, legislation, and of course, sectoral engagement. We need to engage all the relevant stakeholders. So we collaborate with the government, and in this case, with the Mozambican government, to ensure that proper policy and legislation was in place. And this, of course, required liaising with many different people besides the government. Then the second component is focused on developing the data, technical tools, and guidance to implement the policies and the system itself. Okay, so we need to determine if the country has got everything that is required to put this in place. In many cases, it's not like it was the case of Mozambique, which I'll explain in a minute. And then, of course, providing the capacity. So we're talking about, the training, facilitate knowledge changes to build the capacity and empower all the stakeholders. So not only the government, but all the remaining stakeholders, especially the private sector, consultants, Academia is also really important, and civil society in general. And finally, the implementation mechanism. So in practice, this includes mechanisms such as aggregated offsets or mitigation banking, which help ensure that biodiversity impacts from development projects are addressed in a structured and effective way. And these systems are designed to ensure that developers contribute meaningfully to national biodiversity targets, while, as said before by some of my colleagues, also mobilizing private sector investments into conservation. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is what we have achieved in Mozambique under the first component I told you. So it was necessary. So there was an initial roadmap that was developed with the World Bank support, more or less at the same time, or just slightly before we started with the program in Mozambique. And that facilitated a lot because it allowed for previous discussions to take place. And then, a long process, a multi-stakeholder participatory process, which took over 25 meetings with more than 200 people, led to the development of specific legislation for the implementation of the biodiversity offsets through Ministerial Diploma 55 2022. I'll explain a bit more about the system a bit further. Then other complementary legislation, like, for example, the specific legislation for the peer review of category A+ projects. So projects, mega projects, basically oil and gas, mining, etc. They require independent peer review, which is really important for the mitigation hierarchy process. Then also we developed the guidelines for the practical implementation of the diploma. If people know IFC Performance Standard 6 and the guidance notes, the ministerial diploma would be Performance Standard 6, and the guidance and the implementation manual, the guidance notes. And then, as also said, we focused on developing governance systems. So we supported the government on establishing a specific unit on biodiversity offsets within the National Directorate of Environment. And then complementary to that, and it was also stipulated in the legislation, we helped establish and training a technical scientific unit for supporting the biodiversity offset division within the licensing unit. So this has got a complementary role because it provides advice and also allows how to frame the offsetting process within the national strategy and so on. And of course, there were lots of lessons learned from this. So next slide, please. So here you can just move forward. So the objective is that we ensure that first impacts are avoided, minimized, restored, and then only residual impacts are to be offset. So this is an integrated offset system. Okay, so offsets need to be implemented in specific designated areas, protected areas that are underfunded and not achieving their conservation objectives. And this is to ensure additionality, and also other important biodiversity areas such as KBAs, Ramsar sites, etc., that are not also protected, or in this case, sorry, that are not protected and are also under severe threats. So this is the way how we organize the segregated offset system is particularly important because land in Mozambique is owned by the state, so there is no private land. So to ensure permanence, we need to do it in areas that are recognized by the government as being for conservation purposes. So geographic location is also defined because ecological equivalence is required, as well as the type of activities that can be implemented through offsets. So these can be managed and implemented by the project developer or through a third party. And the implementation models and stakeholders depend on whether the offset is inside or outside the protected area. And there are also oversight and independent verification mechanisms. So each project has its own oversight committee, which is comprised of relevant national and local stakeholders. Then there is also this independent audits every 5 years, because in Mozambique, environmental licenses are due every 5 years. And this independent audit is necessary before the license can be issued. So, and depending on the results, the license might or not be issued. Next slide, please. So in terms of technical tools in Mozambique, we had a huge lack of information, of data. So, for example, we developed a historical ecosystem map for Mozambique. It is the most detailed map ever made for Mozambique. We conducted a national red listing of ecosystem. We also mapped the key biodiversity areas according to the 2016 IUCN standards, and these were embedded in the legislation as areas that should be avoided by development, both at spatial plans and also in specific legislation. We developed tools for conducting restoration suitability analysis, then also online portals to serve data, so the National Biodiversity Information System, and also an environmental licensing platform. And this was conducted with WCMC from UNEP. This platform already integrates the offset registry. And then, of course, lots of guidance, including ecological condition metrics for the most relevant ecosystems and also for species. We can move on for next slide. The next slide. In terms of capacity building, just in the second phase of Combo between 2021 and 2025, we had 29 training sessions with almost 1,200 trainees and 247 institutions. So this included, of course, the government, especially those units I've mentioned, but also then, private sector, financial sector, civil society, academia, students, all these were really relevant. Also really important was the exchange of experiences we had with some companies and the government on how mitigation was being implemented on the ground and how that could be improved and so forth. Next slide, please. And we are close to the last. So we also, then in terms of the implementation mechanism, we developed 4 pilots. These 4 pilots were in protected areas, 1 outside the protected area, different types of protected areas, different types of ecosystems, different types of implementation mechanisms, including through local communities. So that was the purpose of these pilots, to test the legislation, test the guidelines, and let people learn by doing. BioFund, the local conservation trust fund, was a key player on all this. They led most of the pilots and they had a very active role. And we also supported BioFund on how to define their role in the future of the offset system that was developed for Mozambique. And of course, lots of lessons learned and case studies were produced, and they are available through the Combo website. And last slide, please. Okay, so the first offset plans are in the pipeline. So the first biodiversity offset management plans have been developed by some companies. One is particularly close to the end. They are being reviewed by the government. Some adjustments still need to be done. And what we realize is that some complementary tools needs to be developed to unlock some bottlenecks, as Amrei explained. So one of them is to have the full list of priority offset receiving areas, and this is currently being conducted with the support of BIOFIN. A loss and gain accounting tool, which is still lacking. All the details are in the legislation, but the tool itself still needs to be put together. And what we are currently conducting with Terrasos is a comparative analysis and a roadmap on how to upgrade the current aggregated offset system into a full mitigation banking system, which we believe will be much more useful to Mozambique and will provide more investment, allow for more investment in conservation, and will be much easier to implement by pretty much everyone. So thank you so much. Sorry for taking a bit longer, and that's it on my side.
Excellent. Thank you, Hugo. And as I said, we will share these slides and a lot of those useful tools, links, and resources we will share as well. So if you have any questions for Hugo, do put them in the question answers, and we should have some time to come to those once we finish the next presentation. So if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A box. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Greg DeYoung to take us through the United States experience. Greg, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Tom. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and I'm so impressed with all the work that's been done in various parts of the globe. So kudos to everybody and the work that they've accomplished. And yes, there we go. This is going to be an overview, a very general overview, trying to capture the experience of the US as a whole and not so much focused on what my particular company has been doing. We have a rich history, and I'll go into that. I do want to say before we go to the next slide that this is a photograph of a floodplain restoration project. It's something that we call a multi-benefit mitigation bank. It's also referred to as a multi-authority mitigation bank because it has credits that have been issued by yes, in this case, two different federal agencies and one state agency. It has offsets for wetlands, riparian habitat, salmon, and some other species as well. Next slide, please. So our legal framework or foundation goes back over a half century now, and there are two main types of compensatory mitigation. They're driven by these two laws, the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. Those are both over a half century old. And I do want to draw your attention to item number 1, the Clean Water Act. There is, you can see there, a wetland mitigation rule that was adopted in 2008. That's important to the demand side of our equation. I know we've had quite a bit of conversation about that. In contrast, if you look at item number 2, we have a policy, the conservation banking policy. That's a very different footing for a market for these kinds of offsets to have. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide, please. We have a database that is called Ribbits, and it's operated by our Army Corps of Engineers. And just doing a query in terms of the number of wetland mitigation banks, again, driven by the Clean Water Act, we have just under 3,000, and this is the distribution shown for that. And next slide, please. And this is the species banks, typically called conservation banks. And you can see it's quite a few fewer. It's about 1/10 of the number. And the vast majority of those banks are in the state of California. Part of that is that in California, we have our own state-adopted Endangered Species Act. Part of it, too, is political will. Amrei mentioned that critical component, political will, and I could tell you some stories about that piece of it, but I don't think we have time. Next slide, please. Our industry, as a result of this long-running experimentation, really, and then rule and policy adoption, it's grown quite a bit. And in this University of North Carolina study showed that the industry generates over 20,000 jobs, about 3.5 billion in annual economic output, and a pretty healthy growth rate, a little over 5% annual growth rate. And it has quite a diverse range of investment. It can be institutional investors. It can be just individual people financing these projects themselves. In my case, Westervelt Ecological Services, we have a parent company that has its own internal funds, and we also have an institutional investor from Canada called CDPQ. Next slide, please. What is in a project? This is pretty critical, and on the right you can see the principles for ecological restoration and compensatory mitigation. This is by our national industry association called the Ecological Restoration Business Association, or ERBA. And we've talked a little bit about those principles. I've heard the idea of additionality and permanence or durability. Also, a big one for us, and I think Vanessa touched on it, is equivalency. So if we're going to have a market, we need to make sure that we have equivalent standards for all mechanisms, all mitigation mechanisms. So if there's a fee program or just an individual project by project mitigation effort, those need to have the same standards as a mitigation bank. In essence, a mitigation bank or a species conservation bank, it needs to have certain ingredients, and essentially those are ecological preserves, and they may include preservation, restoration, or enhancement. They have to have permanent legal protection. They need to have long-term planning and also financing. That's a critical element. And I think we've gotten fairly good at that in the US. And then there needs to be a clear and valid crediting program. And that crediting can be based on acres, the presence of species. It can include ecological function or a combination of all of the above. And that's maybe its own webinar, but I think that there have been some good examples that encompass what we call species richness or diversity. Next slide, please. Ingredients for success, I touched on that previously. We need to have stable laws, rules, and policies, predictability, and timeliness. We struggled with that in the US, the timeliness factor. In fact, EPIC did a study on how long it takes to get a mitigation bank approved, and that was an incredibly revealing study that helped refocus our collective attention on what are we doing? How are these approval processes working today? So it's created a lot of innovation and I think reform of how these projects are reviewed and approved. And then we need to have the demand. Personally, I think that comes first if you're going to attract investment. And then, of course, high quality projects. And I think a number of people touched on that. Vanessa talked about it. But we need to have clear ecological outcomes, durability, and sustainability. Next slide, please. There are a number of benefits that I think we've all talked about. Private sector can be efficient in implementation. There are efficiencies for permittees, and most permittees aren't really set up to do their own offsets, their own mitigation. In this present day, we're pretty good at creating durable ecological results, and that can be done in a context of continuing community development. And it provides a new use for land. In other words, there is now a different value for land that can go into these preserves. And then, as we saw, there's quite a bit of employment and economic contributions that can be brought. Next slide, please. What's ahead? There is quite a bit of tension today between a movement for deregulation from our federal administration and environmental quality. We consistently get polls of the public that support at a very high level, 70, 80%. I don't know the current numbers. People want high quality environment. So there's this tension between the current politics of deregulation, but the public wanting continuing environmental quality. There's a lot of court involvement in various aspects of federal law and regulation. There's a push toward having regulation occur at the state government level versus the federal government level. There's currently an effort to reform in our Congress to reform the Endangered Species Act. Our industry is following that to find out if there are opportunities to improve aspects of the Endangered Species Act with stronger provisions and more clarity in certain ways. And then if we're going to deregulate, but the public wants a strong environment or a sound environment, then are there opportunities for more proactive conservation? That's actually written into some of our laws, but the implementation hasn't been strong. And then what happens with our next federal administration? I do want to point out part of what we've been learning is that there's just much more durability in law, and that's you see on the right, the figure of the trunk of the tree, much more durability, some durability in regulation because there's a multi-year process typically to change or eliminate a regulation. Policy is right out there on the very tips of the exposed to the political winds, and policies can be summarily rescinded. And so we're experiencing some of that right now. So that's just something to keep in mind when we're setting up systems that will support markets. Next slide, please. And that's it for my presentation, Tom.
Excellent, Greg. No, fascinating to see in a mature market that ongoing refinement and adjustment. Really important also to look at some of those broader socio-economic impacts, which I know many countries who are thinking about establishing these schemes are keen to be aware of. You know, what is the potential for job creation? What's the broader economic impact of this? And really love the tree at the end there to exemplify the durability, as you say, of law above policy regulations. All right, well, thank you, Hugo, Greg. That gives us a really good grounding, I think, in a couple of countries' experience. I just want to take us through a few slides now just to wrap things up and speak to where we are going as a collective. So yeah, it was really interesting to see those two experiences from Mozambique in the US, you know, two countries at different ends of the spectrum when it comes to implementing these schemes. And this is really a key factor we have observed as a group. There are different levels and types of support required. So with the Compensatory Conservation Scheme Support Network, or C2S2, we aim to support governments at different stages of their journey, whether it's exploration or optimization and refinement. We want to be able to support tailored to the needs of particular governments. And this support could be technical or institutional in its nature. It could be around short-term sprints or long-term engagement in its time frame. The partners of C2S2 will coordinate their efforts to really best meet whatever the explicit needs of governments are. And over the coming months, in the run-up to COP17, we want to identify a first cohort of countries to engage with a view to formally launching C2S2 in Armenia in October. So if you're a government representative that wants to know more about how you can engage and be supported, please do reach out. The fundamental idea behind C2S2 is really to provide a go-to network of experienced organizations that can respond to the growing needs of governments as they explore and optimize compensatory conservation schemes. And as we do this, we can build a network of market participants that can share insight and learnings along the way. So what next? Next week, we will publish the design components that I teased earlier. You'll receive a link as part of the follow-up email. And in the coming months, we'll publish some very short but supplementary case studies that aim to exemplify these components, just like we have done today with the panel discussion and with the experiences of Mozambique in the US, to make sure that these components are really drawing from ground level experience, so to speak of. So if you're interested to explore how C2S2 can support you, please do reach out and we can have a conversation. Okay, that's it for now. I would like to do a final thank you to all of our speakers. So thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Vanessa, Amrei, Hugo, and Greg. Thank you to the audience and for your questions coming in. We do aim to have more webinars in the near future, which may zone in on specific topics to be determined, but we will keep you informed as those plans emerge. And just to finalize in saying that the slides recording and the design components will be emailed to you next week. So you'll have all of those to hand. So thank you all for participating. Really appreciate your time and have a great rest of the day.